the Iranians have to be very strategic in their response to the Americans and the Israelis. And the reason why is the Americans and the Israelis have military dominance over Iran. But just because you have military dominance does not mean you'll win the war. Okay? So what I believe is that Iran and Israel are committed to a war. And it's possible that in 2 years' time, there will be a ground invasion of Iran. Okay? But it's going to take time to build up to the ground invasion. But just because the Americans and the Israelis attack Iran does not mean they will win. Okay? And the reason why is that, as you know from your research, in 2002, the Americans actually tried to invade Iran. Okay? They ran a simulation called the 2002 Millennium Challenge. And the idea is, let's pretend that we will invade Iran and let's see what happens. So they divide the military into two teams, right? Team USA and Team Iran. Now, if you know anything about the American military, you will know that it is the most dominant, powerful military ever to exist in human history, okay? It is crazy powerful. If the entire world were to get together and said, let's go fight the United States, the world would lose. The United States has the most powerful military in the entire world, okay? And Iran, it's a very poor country. So the United States invaded Iran and they wanted to see what would happen. And it turned out that who won? Iran won, okay? And the reason why Iran won is the idea of asymmetrical warfare, all right? And this is a very important idea that you must know if you are to understand this conflict. So what is asymmetrical warfare? All right, let's pretend that Jack and I are enemies. We hate each other and we want to kill each other, okay? Jack has armor and he has a machine gun. I have nothing, okay? So in most battles, Jack's going to kill me, right? But let's pretend that I live in a dark forest. And it's really hard to see in this dark forest, but I've been living there for decades, okay? So I know this dark forest very, very well. So if Jack attacks me in this dark forest, then it's possible for me to win because I can set traps, right? I can play tricks on Jack. And that's the idea of asymmetrical warfare, okay? Even though Jack is superior, because I'm inferior, I'm forced to be much more strategic in how I fight against Jack, okay? And so asymmetrical warfare means that as long as you can define the terms of engagement, as long as you can control how the war is fought, you will win. So let's look at what this means for Iran and the United States. So the United States has these aircraft carriers, and they cost like $1 billion, okay? They're very expensive, but they're very powerful. Now, in a symmetrical warfare, what would happen is Iran sends its entire navy against this one aircraft carrier of the United States. And then what happens? The United States blows up the entire Iranian navy, okay? That's what would happen. So you don't do that, okay? You do not send your navy against an American aircraft carrier. What you do instead is you send drones, okay? Or drone swarms. So what they did in the Millennium Challenge was they had these suicide boats, right? Charging these aircraft carriers. And guess what, guys? If there's a lot of them, like 1,000 of them, you can't stop all of them. And if one hits, then your boat sinks. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? This is what we call asymmetrical warfare. Now, what's important to understand is that in asymmetrical warfare, you have to control how much resources you use, okay? So, for example, this aircraft carrier costs like $1 billion. The drone swarms, okay, a drone may be $1,000 for a real one, okay? But then you have fake ones that cost $100. $1,000 are these drones that blow up, right? $100 are drones that don't blow up, right? You have 1,000 of these, and then that's like $10 million. And then you have 10,000 of these, and that's another $10 million, okay? So it will cost you maybe $20 million to blow up a $1 billion aircraft carrier. Okay? Does that make sense? And this is why Iran would win a war, because Iran would employ asymmetrical warfare, drone swarms against the American aircraft carrier. And the true promise actually showed us that the Iranians would probably use this strategy. And the reason why is that the total package, the strike package that the Iranians used, cost about $10 to $30 million. But how much money did the Israelis spend to bring down these drones? Do you guys know? How much did it cost the Israelis to defend themselves against this attack? Okay. It was at least $1 billion. Okay, do you understand? All right. So this shows us that in a war, Iran would use asymmetrical warfare, and it and even though Israel and the United States have military dominance, they may not be able to win this war, okay? Okay, so does this make sense so far? Any questions? The Iranians will use this asymmetrical warfare strategy against the Americans. And so shouldn't the Americans respond with more strategic thinking? And that's a great question. And the answer is the Americans would not do that. Why not? Why is it that asymmetrical warfare is so effective against empires and dominant military powers? What's the problem of empires usually? What is their biggest problem? What is their fatal flaw? Okay, they have too much bureaucracy, but Iran also has bureaucracy. But the empires have a much bigger problem, okay? Now let's go back to the Millennium Challenge. Now, in the first test, in the first battle, Iran won against the United States, right? So what did the United States do? And do what? They did it again. They did another second. They did a second simulation. In the second simulation, what did they do? Exactly, okay? What the Americans said is, nope, this is cheating, guys. Did you understand? Asymmetrical warfare is cheating. You cannot cheat. And then the Americans won. Does that make sense? Okay? So remember, in the first instance where you are allowed to use asymmetrical warfare, the Iranians won. In the second instance, the Americans said, no, asymmetrical warfare is cheating. So you're not allowed to use asymmetrical warfare. You must fight us directly. And the Americans won. What does this tell us about the American military? Exactly. Thank you, okay? They are inflexible. Empires are inflexible. And the reason why is the idea of hubris, right? If you're an empire, you refuse to admit your failings and faults. You become very stubborn, okay? So it's back to the example of Jack has his machine gun, his armor, right? He comes in the Stark Force thinking like, I'm invincible, right? And like everyone's like, Jack, don't go into that dark forest. It's stupid. But Jack's like, no, I have a machine gun. I don't care, all right? So that's the situation. That's why asymmetrical warfare is so effective, because it allows you flexibility and creativity, and the empire, the dominant power, refuses to be flexible and creative, okay? Does that make sense? All right. And so the classic example of this is Vietnam, where the Vietnamese were clearly dominated by the Americans, but the Vietnamese were using extremely creative and flexible tactics against Americans, whereas the Americans insisted on their main military doctrine. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. Great. Okay. Any more questions? That was a great question. Thank you. Any more questions before we move on? Okay. So now I want to talk about, okay, if the Iranians are going to use asymmetrical warfare, what would it look like? And the answer is this. When the Americans invade, okay, the war started. Before the invasion, the Iranians must do 4 things if it is to prevail in the war, okay? And this is what we call the Iran strategy matrix. The Iran strategy matrix means that from now on, everything they do must fit into the strategy matrix, okay? It must accomplish the objectives of the strategy matrix. So the first thing it must do is unite the population. Second thing it must do is build alliances. And the third thing is win global opinion. The fourth is weaken the enemy. So in other words, everything that Iran is going to do from now until the actual invasion will be to accomplish all 4 goals at once. And it must, if it is to survive a full-scale American invasion, okay?